Hello and welcome everybody to, I think this is the first afternoon session we've had at the Vienna Humanities Festival. For those of you who were in the AULA and the last session, listening to Mary Sarot talk about NATO expansion, well, here's possibly an even bigger side of the geopolitical coin at the moment, and that is because the subject of our conversation now is going to be China and relations between the United States and China, between Europe and China, the domestic politics of China, and of course the future. And we are extremely fortunate to have secured the presence of ISABEL HILTON, because there are a few people who know more about this subject than she does, having studied Chinese at Edinburgh University before going on to do postgraduate work at the Beijing Languages Institute and Fudan University. She has enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a foreign correspondent. Those of us from the Anglo-American sphere have been reading her in the Sunday Times, in the New Yorker, in the Independent, listening to her on the BBC. It's not only China that she knows about European politics a lot, she knows a lot about South American politics as well, and so has a great global reach. She was originally going to work for the BBC in 1976, but then what happened, Isabel?
MI5 apparently decided that the BBC employing me was too much of a threat to the nation, so I was blacklisted, which I didn't actually find out about till 10 years later, by which time I was happily employed on newspapers. But I was pretty outraged to discover that just having spent all that time learning about China was not only not a qualification for a job, but a singular disqualification for a job.
Apparently they sourced it down to your activity at the Scottish Chinese Association, am I right?
Yes, the Scotland China Association, I actually hadn't been a member of this thing, but when I got back from China, from 2 years in China, the then head of department, who was the chair of the Scotland China Association, said they were short of a secretary and would I help, which I was, one's obligation to one's teacher and all that. So my activities consisted of helping to organize a population a conference on population, which was opened by a man called Richie Calder, who you may remember, who opened it with a very unsuitable joke, which I won't repeat, and a fundraising sale, and that was it. But apparently the nation was fragile at the time, and these activities meant that I was blacklisted, which was curious because the historian of the BBC was actually chair of the Anglo-Chinese, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, SACU, whom the Scots thought were altogether too fellow-travelling because they would take money from the Chinese, which the Scots wouldn't. And so when the then controller of BBC Scotland on getting this news from MI5, and he was a former editor of The Guardian, so he wasn't a BBC lifer, and he said, well, I want to know more about this. And he, on being told what the issue was, he then made inquiries and found that several members of the Broadcasting Council were also members of the Scotland China Association, as was the Dean of the Faculty of Divinity of Edinburgh University. So we were clearly a dangerous bunch.
So we can confirm here in public that you weren't working as a spy for Mao and the Gang of Four?
Not that I was aware of, no.
Good. Now we've cleared that up,
Good.
We can move on. And we're going to talk straight away. I'd like to ask you immediately about China's domestic politics, both the political situation and, of course, now the economic situation. But let's start with President Xi Jinping and the pretty dramatic turn in terms of Chinese politics when he assumed power when was it, 8 or 9 years ago?
2012, 2013, he really
2015,
came in.
yeah.
13.
13. So 10 years ago, why do you think that he introduced such a dramatic shift in the way Chinese society is structured, i.e., introducing a lot of repressive measures and basically moving away from the gentle liberalization that we'd seen over 20 years or so?
It's still, I mean, the most direct answer to that is that the party wants to stay in power forever. And if you look at the decade that preceded Xi Jinping coming to power, it was a decade of liberalization, as you say, and there's much mockery now of the idea that China could have evolved in a different political direction. But I remember reading a paper. There were a lot of people who were studying the transition in Europe, for example. Obviously, Putin was, told the Chinese that they must never liberalize because look what might happen. But in that decade, after in what was still in the penumbra of the Deng Xiaoping era, people were very actively looking at how a transition might be managed. I met a scholar from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who'd been studying the Hungarian transition, for example, an interesting one to study because it was a peaceful evolution. It didn't, And I think that most of these scholars concluded that, as had happened in Europe, it was perfectly possible for the party to split into its composite factions and contest power relatively peacefully. Essentially, the same people or similar people would be running the country. It needn't descend into bloodshed. It could be managed. And that was a very, very live discussion at a time when the economy had delivered 20 years of rapidly rising incomes with a lot of problems, but nevertheless, China had joined the WTO, was open to the world. There was a great deal of coming and going. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of other, social problems that emerged, as they do when you get that kind of rapid transition. But it would have been possible. And I think that what Xi Jinping represented was, if you like, the party saying, no, we are not going that route, relabeling the whole experiment from Deng Xiaoping onwards, and certainly through Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao, as a flawed experiment. The other political aspects, I think, of the Deng Xiaoping legacy were things like term limits. So instead of, Deng Xiaoping designed a system to avoid having Mao Zedong return, essentially, and not a rerun of Mao Zedong. And that meant that, you got one 5-year term and then a second, and then you were expected to retire from the top job. It meant that a lot of the functions of the state were devolved to the state from the party. So essentially the running of the economy, of course, everyone's in the party, but it wasn't necessarily being driven by the party. So you got, for example, the build-up of a legal system, which China really hadn't had under Mao. Partly because if you're going to do business, you need a legal system because, there are contracts and disputes. But also there was the beginning of a pretty widespread legal system, which was about the defense of citizens' rights and the idea that the citizen had rights, which again had not existed under Mao. Essentially, the only rights you had were the rights the party might give you, and they could be taken away, so they weren't really rights. But all of that had grown. And so you come to 2012, and Xi Jinping is the chosen candidate of the party. And in 2013, a document is published. It's called Document 9. It's leaked, actually, not published. And the woman who got hold of it spent some time in jail as a result. But it is a directive in which lists. And Document 9 just means it's the 9th major directive of that year. And it lists the things that the party regards as existential threats to the existence of the party and to the continuing control of the party. And they are pretty much everything that I think you and I, Misha, would regard as desirable in a society. So separation of powers, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, free press, the whole shooting. And all of those civil society, so-called civil society. All of those were listed as threats to the party. And from that point onwards, you see the unrolling of the suppression of all of those phenomena. And that includes a famous weekend when more than 70 human rights lawyers were arrested in one weekend, along with their ancillary workers and so on. And some of them never got out. Some of them were released, some of them were not. And the progressive restriction of what had been a very vibrant civil society, you know, in the first decade of this century, all kinds of self-organized groups were doing all kinds of things. And, you know, the Chinese are very good at self-organization. They're very entrepreneurial. And all of that has been, you know, squished and subdued or taken under party control. So that is, it's about party control. The party now explicitly rules everything.
Just briefly, to what extent is that a legacy of Maoism and Stalinism, and to what extent is it a more ancient fear of the bureaucracy in China that when things fall apart from the center, then they really fall apart?
Well, of course, that does exist in China. It's always, China's now twice the size it was at the end of the Ming Dynasty, but even up to the Ming Dynasty, it was a very big place, and a lot of people lived there, as General de Gaulle allegedly said. So that when things do slip, you do have a risk, and it repeatedly happened, that in between dynasties, until somebody got back on top again, you had warring factions, you had contests for power, you had China divided between, you know, northern and southern dynasties and so on, and that happened repeatedly. And so yes, there is a kind of, if you like, in Chinese statecraft, there is a fear of loss of control. But then there's also the other thing, which is too much central control, because it's very difficult to run China just from the center. And there are lots of, you know, famous expressions in Chinese statecraft to the effect that, you know, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. And actually, he doesn't know what we're doing. He can issue whatever edict he likes, but he's not going to find us in our little corner of China, and we're going to do what suits us. And the tension, it's called fang shou, you know, the tension between tightening and loosening, between devolution of power to the provinces and tightening to the center, is another recurring feature of Chinese politics. So yes, the fear of falling apart, the fear of transition, of course, is a sensible concern. Hence, a lot of the discussion that was going on. But also, I think the party, you know, the party can justify its actions in those terms. But there's a lot that went with the reassertion of party control, which is really just about party control, about ideology, about what kind of state the party wants to have and project.
So as they started unrolling the provisions of Directive 9 and looking at the things which they considered threats to party hegemony, how quick was the West to pick up on the changes? We had symbolic things like the arrests of the booksellers, the human rights lawyers, as you said. Was there still a sense for 2 or 3 years that actually maybe this is a kind of a steadying of the course which was necessary, or were people worried from the beginning that he was going to go for this tough line?
It sort of depends who you are and what you worry about. If you were concerned about China's political evolution, yes, you would worry about it. The things that were being said were very clear, that it was going back to an ideologized state with a supreme leader. Now, it took Xi Jinping a while to consolidate that, and it's kind of quite interesting how he did that. But if you were, for example, a German businessman, you probably thought that doesn't really affect me too much. If you were...
Might be the case today as well.
I think they're getting a little more worried now. But if you were a diplomat or a foreign statesman, you know, in a sense, what China does up to a point within China's borders is okay. But as time goes on, a number of things happen. So the politics in the West changed. 2016 happens, the year that I would abolish entirely if I had a superpower. and so we get into whenever there's an American election in recent years, China's been, anti-China sentiment plays well in the hustings, and of course Trump comes in with a very strong anti-China line. At the same time, in China, you have an increasingly assertive nationalist position, and you're beginning to see things like Xinjiang, which are shocking and unignorable, even for a relatively complacent West, and then Hong Kong.
Yeah, so you have Xinjiang, you have incidents like Bo Xilai, which was...
Bo Xilai was preceded Xi Jinping coming to power. It was part of the entertainment in the run-up to Xi
Jinping's.
Yeah, so he was taking out the opposition, essentially.
That's right, so he was preparing the way.
Yeah.
You had the anti-corruption drive, which is simultaneously an anti-corruption drive and a power consolidation play.
Yeah, it's worth dwelling on that a little bit. An anti-corruption drive is part of this sort of standard toolkit of any incoming Chinese leader, essentially because your predecessor will have planted people that might be annoying to you. Also because it's a huge country, it's full of factions and contested ideas, and if you want to neutralize your enemy, anti-corruption is a really easy way to do it. And the analogy, which please don't misinterpret this, but if a mafia boss is arrested, you don't ask if he's a criminal, essentially, because he's in the mafia, right? You ask, how did he lose his protection? And it's the same with an anti-corruption drive. Essentially, the party is institutionally corrupt. It's very hard to thrive if you're not corrupt in a corrupt institution. So everybody, it's not hard to bring corruption charges against anyone. The question is why him and not the other guy? And that's all about factions. And Xi Jinping has run, normally they last about 3 years. We're now more than 10 years in. We are still seeing really senior people being taken down in an anti-corruption drive. There was one significant moment quite early on when a man called Zhou Yongkang went into special measures, as it called at the beginning. And Zhou Yongkang had been a standing committee member of the Politburo. You don't get much higher than that in China. There are between 7 and 9 of them, depending on how much the leader wants. He'd also been a huge figure in China's oil industry, and he had run China's security services. So he was absolutely central to the state. And he went down in an anti-corruption drive, at which point it becomes quite obvious that Xi Jinping, who at that point had not changed the constitution, could not stand down, because a condition of term limits, of rotation of power, of collective leadership, is that it's safe to leave office. And he had made it unsafe to leave office by taking down Zhou Yongkang. So that meant that he himself, he can't leave until
he has
he's
no
either
choice.
forced
So
to
actually,
or,
rather similar to Putin, in a sense, Putin cannot leave power because
it's too dangerous.
Won't be secure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the reasons I'm sure Xi Jinping tried to justify the clampdown was the economy. But if we look at the economy over the past 5 to 6 years, it hasn't been a happy place, the Chinese economy. What's gone wrong there? Is it structural? Was it COVID? Is it the greater interference by the party in the economy, or is it the hangover of the neoliberal period in terms of things like the Evergreen or whatever the housing thing is?
Evergrande.
Evergrande.
Yeah, again, it's worth looking at the first decade of the century where you're still going, I'll go back to 1989 actually, in Tiananmen. Essentially the deal after Tiananmen, when the PLA had opened fire on Chinese citizens in large numbers were killed, great shock to the nation. The deal after that, in 92, Deng Xiaoping relaunched his liberalization of the economy with the Southern Tour. And the promise essentially is that if you stay out of politics, we will make you richer. So just get on with making money, leave the management of the country to us. And it was a deal that pretty much held, for quite a long time. Not entirely, because there are always things to protest about, and there were a lot of protests. But essentially, there was no direct challenge to power. They managed a peaceful transition from Deng Xiaoping to the WIEN era, the first one, the only one, actually, in the history of the People's Republic. So things were kind of settled. Now, if you look at what is often, in my view, misdescribed as the Chinese miracle, what they're actually doing is what every Asian tiger did, only they're doing it on a massive scale. So they're taking rural populations, and putting them into factories where you start off by making cheap, low added value goods. You find a market for them. You join the WTO, whoa, market, globalization. You then become the world's factory because you still have these very well disciplined, hardworking people. So you lower the cost of manufacture for Western companies. Western economies begin to deindustrialize because they're moving to China and so on and so forth. All of that goes great guns until it doesn't. And there comes a point when you have used up all your initial advantages. No more cheap countryside labor, your own living standards have gone up, everything that goes into the factory is getting more expensive, everything that's coming out of the factory is under pressure to be cheaper. So it begins not to work. And those very high GDP ambitions tail off. And that is the point at which every Asian tiger before them began to worry about the middle income trap, where you've raised your standards of living to medium, but you can't quite get to the higher echelon of economic success and technological prowess. So you need to start thinking about becoming more efficient and moving up the technology value chain. Taiwan did it, South Korea did it, Japan did it.
Japan originally.
That's what you do. And China, around 2006, 2007, begins to think about that. And so that's, kind of part of the story. It's adjustment of, it's a big cyclical one. Of course, I want to talk about what they invested in, but we might do that in a later, I know you want to talk about climate change, but at that point, that's what they were thinking about. So they begin to invest in higher technologies and so on and so forth, but that means that, the growth rate slows. That's pretty much okay, depending on what level of general prosperity you've achieved. And the problem China has is that the level of general prosperity is much lower than, for example, Japan, when Japan hit that moment. China also decides to do something that Japan did. In the mid-90s, Japan was overbuilt and had a lot of surplus capacity and decided to build infrastructure across Central Asia, maybe finance it, and that would absorb the surplus capacity and be good for political influence. That, in Chinese terms, became the Belt and Road in 2013. Exactly the same model, only again on a bigger scale. Now, when you come to more recent times, under Xi Jinping, the direction has been, if we are going to be consolidating and slowing down, then we want to reserve the benefits of the Chinese economic activity to the Chinese entrepreneurs and the Chinese people. So with the geopolitical tensions, they begin to see that export markets could be, interrupted. All kinds of things can be, and COVID doesn't help. So they want to build a domestic consumption. It's a huge internal market. And they want to reduce the dependency both on investment and on exports. Now, investment is all about property. Pouring concrete. It's hugely, hugely overinvested. It's a much bigger part of the Chinese, proportion of the Chinese economy than anywhere else on earth. And they have just built, the number of empty apartments would house the entire population of the United Kingdom. So, they've just gone on pouring concrete. There are a lot of reasons why they went on pouring concrete. One, it was relatively easy. Two, the provincial authorities are underfunded, and one of the ways they made up the gap in the budget was to seize agricultural land, rezone it, borrow and build on it. That's left them with massive internal debts. And so now the whole house of cards is beginning to tumble. And that's a big worry.
That's a big worry for China, and of course it's a big worry for the world as well.
It's a worry for the world in some ways. The Western financial crisis was another stimulus to China pouring concrete, and China essentially dragged a lot of the world out of recession by its demands for raw materials, for example. So a lot of suppliers of raw materials did okay despite the recession. China can't do that anymore. So, China will no longer be the engine of growth in that way. There is a huge debate amongst economists about what actually happens when Evergrande or Country Garden or any of those massive property companies really goes under. They're in slow motion bankruptcy now. The feeling in general terms, and I'm not an economist, is that it's relatively contained within China. It's not like the US subprime rolling collapse. But of course, there will be contagion inside the Chinese economy. And one of the frustrations that the regime has at the moment, having tried to build up the consumer market, is that the canny Chinese consumer is saying, well, I'm not sure about this, because I have invested in 3 spare apartments because the prices kept going up, and now you're about to destroy my life savings. You want me to buy stuff? Well, not really.
Forget it.
So, there is, of course, a problem. There is an internal problem.
So I wanted to move on to China's relations with the rest of the world, and particularly the United States. The United States, as you indicated, and indeed Europe, having, the US really turned China into the manufacturing heartland of the US in the 1990s and 2000s. And then the political circumstances change, the risks. You have this relationship which is a collaborative relationship becoming a competitive relationship, now a rivalry, and we start to get the issue of China, of Taiwan. And at the heart of this competition is technology. Who is going to control the future? Who do you think is going to control the future, the US or China?
Seriously, Misha?
Well, let's talk about.
We segment that a little bit.
Yes, let's talk about that specific competition in high tech. As you said, they were manufacturing iPhones. That's going to be more problematic. They were manufacturing all sorts of technology for Western consumers.
Right.
That's slowing down. We've had US sanctions slapped on specific companies, on specific sectors. The Chinese can't access the advanced microprocessors, which are ironically 80% of them produced in Taiwan. This has really soured the relationship between the US and China.
Yes. So a number of things happen to make that confrontation worse. And one is that China is running massive trade surpluses with everybody, except marginally Germany, but certainly with the United States. And part of Trump's nationalist pitch, his making America great again, is to try to force the Chinese to buy more goods and to, erect barriers to the import of Chinese goods into the United States. Well, anyway, but that's his pitch. On the Chinese side, that moment that I touched on in sort of 2006, 7, 8, where they start thinking, what's the next driver of the Chinese economy going to be, and we need to move up the value chain, they also began to think about what the technologies of the future were. It was also, 2005 was the year that China became the world's biggest emitter of CO2, of carbon emissions. And they began to think, whoops, we are going to come under pressure over this. Combining those two thoughts, if you look at the 11th, 12th, and 13th five-year plans, where is the investment going? It's going into all the technologies that you need for an energy transition. So renewables, nuclear, CCS, a little bit of fusion, and all the associated supply chains that you require. So rare earths, strategic minerals and so on. And they do this to such good effect that essentially they wipe out most of the competition by undercutting them, producing them, cheaper, lower the cost of renewable technologies for everybody, which is a highly positive thing for climate change. And then as the tensions increase between the US and China, and indeed Europe, people think, well, hang on, we need these technologies and China's got a monopoly. But China did see that future, did invest in it, and the West let it happen. And now the West is anxious about the weaponization of supply chains and so on. There are other sets of technologies which are more strategically of concern. So the ones that are to do with telecommunications. Huawei became the big bad beast with 5G, because it was evident that so much of society would be dependent on 5G. And if Huawei had, they installed the basic kit, you were making a bet that nothing would go seriously wrong between you and China for the lifetime of that kit. That began to look like a very poor bet, rather as allowing China to build and operate nuclear power stations, as David Cameron invited, began to look like a poor bet. Because it was quite clear that tensions were going to go on rising. So the security angle of what you allow China to do in your society, despite the fact that they are cheaper and have probably destroyed the competition, becomes a very live issue. And then the other aspect of advanced technologies is that the nature of warfare is changing. The domains of warfare are changing. China starts to become a space power. China has, is building a space platform, and the international one is due to retire in 2030. So, hey, are we going to have to ask permission to use it? China was already a nuclear power. China invests enormously in new forms of rocketry. Now, all of these, and the minerals that go into these technologies, are essentially dual use. And so again, you have it's all right if you're friends, but if you're no longer friends, that becomes a concern. So the United States again starts to think, how do we slow down China's progress in this? And there are, again, many dimensions of this. So one dimension is international regulation of technologies, which is done through the UN. And China has people on every committee and has been working quietly and very hard to ensure that Chinese technology standards are adopted. And that gives you, the kind of advantage that we had in previous technologies. And everyone goes, oh, hang on a minute. We don't really want to be manufacturing to Chinese standards of Chinese. So that's one aspect, if you like, the administrative and regulatory one. And then there is the who's ahead question. And as you say, Taiwan is absolutely sitting in the center of that. And everything that is around TSMC, the manufacturer of the world's most advanced chips, is central to this confrontation.
And, of course, by implication, the whole issue of Taiwan sovereignty claims, blah, 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 blah. Which I say blah, 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 not because it's unimportant, but because before we go to questions, I really want to get your take on China and the environment, because notwithstanding decoupling, notwithstanding the dilemma that Europe faces in terms of does it go with America or does it keep its commercial eggs partially in the Chinese basket, we're only going to solve the climate crisis with planetary cooperation. And that means the US, China, Europe, India, and so on, Brazil, Indonesia, all the big players, they've got to cooperate. Is that conceivable in the current political constellation?
It's not great, but just to reinforce your point of how important it is, there have been high points and low points, particularly of US-China cooperation on climate. And the high point was in the Obama administration, when 2 years before the Paris Conference of the Parties, where we got the Paris Agreement, Xi Jinping and Obama shook hands and agreed to work together to reach a deal in Paris. And remember, this followed the absolute catastrophe of Copenhagen, where everything had fallen apart and it had ended without a deal. The difference between when they're working together and when they're not, when they're essentially competing, is enormous. I mean, the deal in Paris would not have happened without that cooperation. Right. And it wasn't just Paris. There was another less celebrated agreement on working together on aviation emissions, and also the Montreal Protocol, which was about CFCs. Yeah. And that, was a more limited agreement, but again, it was a cooperative one. So at the kind of level of the climate superstructure, the UN process, it is immensely difficult to move forward at the pace required if the US and China are not cooperating. On the other hand, at the level of research collaboration, again, there was a huge high point in that period, and that was almost all destroyed by Trump. But there are enormous advantages to technical and scientific cooperation on climate change with China. China can iterate new technologies on a scale and faster than anybody else. If you want to try out nuclear fusion, it's the only country that's actually doing it. So, we started off in this scientific and technological cooperation with the idea that we would help China, move faster than it otherwise would. But now, you have China, you have an experimental ground in China, which is enormous, and you have technological advances in China, which we could all benefit from. We could all benefit from policy discussions. There's a huge amount of unabated carbon, which could be, solved overnight in rural household, distributed solar, for example. We do that in the UK, they don't do it in China. And a Chinese official who visited the UK recently was desperately interested because he, back home, is stuck trying to fight the big utilities who in China really don't care about this stuff. So there are all sorts of, sub-national conversations that can really move the dial on emissions, which is what we need to do. But they have to happen at the moment rather quietly because, as soon as you're seen to be cooperating with China, you become a bad object. And the whole thing has been weaponized by political factions in the UK as well as in the United States.
I was going to ask about those political factions. There seems to be a large or even growing body of opinion in the US and the UK and some European states that argues, for example, that China is preparing to and will invade Taiwan. Do you hold with that inevitability, or do you think that this is still in the realms of speculation?
I think that China wants, as they would put it, to recover Taiwan. I think Xi Jinping definitely wants his place in history, and that is his place in history. That doesn't, for me, equate to a full-blown military invasion for a number of reasons. It's pretty hard to do. You can't do it quietly. Every preparation for such an invasion would be visible to everybody. So there's no surprise there. And Taiwan would resist. So what do you get if you do it that way? It would be enormously costly in terms of China's global reputation, in terms of everything that China needs, but all still to keep its economy going. And it might destroy TSMC. Now, so what would you do?
TSMC is the manufacturer.
The Taiwan, yeah. It manufactures what?
80%.
80% of the world's most advanced chips, and it's very hard to replicate. So, if I were China, and I had ambitions in that direction, I would do what China did in the South China Sea, which is essentially to militarize the South China Sea without ever provoking, without getting up to that threshold of a shot being fired. So you have elections coming up in January in Taiwan. China and grey zone tactics is a very, very sophisticated story. So the undermining of credibility in Taiwanese democracy, the undermining of the economy, the kind of accidental cutting of the data cables, there are all sorts of things you can do. whilst you make it increasingly difficult and risky for any Western naval power, you know, to position itself to be of use to Taiwan, because just as it's hard to invade, it's also hard to resupply or evacuate anyone from Taiwan. This is not Ukraine. It is a very, very different place and very different conditions. But I would seek to undermine Taiwan to the point where you got a Kuomintang back in power and then make an offer. Now, you know, Taiwanese will say, well, you made an offer to Hong Kong. Look how that turned out.
I was going to say, we haven't mentioned Hong Kong, but that, of course, is
it's a very negative
critical
example.
moment in Xi Jinping and what his intentions are and so on.
Yeah, but I think that unless things in China were so desperate that an external adventure was the better option, that's what I would do. That doesn't mean that's what he will do, but I think that's my bet. And also because our response to grey zone tactics, as we see from the South China Sea, is pretty dismal and ineffective. You know, if China can win that way, as the very much misquoted Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu said, the best war is the one you don't have to fight. And I think that's what they'll do.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. If there are questions, wait for the microphone. I can see a hand there. And so if you wait for the microphone, I'll take, I think, 3 questions at once. If you could introduce yourself, I'd be very grateful.
Hello. I don't think it's, oh yeah. Hi, my name is T. Huang, and thank you for the talk. And I used to work for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is implications from the Ukraine war. Because I think several months ago, in another talk with professional Timothy Schneider, Ivan Krastev, and Misha Glenny, Ivan Krastev said that the aggression war of Russia in Ukraine could give 2 possible implications for China with regard to the West sanctions. For example, the first one is don't start a war, because you know you see the implications of the West and how economic sanctions could also ruin the country's economy. But the second possible implication is don't start a war too late. So what is your take on China and Taiwan in that regard? Because China could look at Putin and, you know, and see that maybe we should have started the war a bit earlier to get more advantage on that, even though you just mentioned that you don't think that is possible, or that's what Xi Jinping would be thinking. So that's my first question. And the second one is, how could the West and China collaborate in the absence of trust, or when there is no conceivable trust? Because you only trust someone when you share the same values and belief with them, right? But in this case, we of course could agree that there's no conceivable trust between the 2 actors. So how would that be materialized? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Lenny, let's have your question as well here at the front.
I'd like to pick up exactly where the previous questioner left off. Isabel, I know you're not a diplomat, but you've always been diplomatic with me. And I'd like to understand, how do you balance confrontation, coordination, collaboration, and competition? As the core question of this panel asks, how do you not ignore the catastrophes in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, yet at the same time advance the kinds of necessary conversations that you speak to between China and the West? How is that done?
Great, Isabel.
Let's just go easy ones then.
So we've got Ukraine, we've got trust, and we've got the difficult paradox of domestic Chinese politics and communication with the outside world.
Yeah. On Ukraine, don't start a war too late is an interesting, it is an interesting observation. And it's not entirely straightforward, I think, to understand the lessons that China is taking from Ukraine, though I'm sure they are taking very careful note. And some of the lessons you can see playing out in subsequent moves. For example, looking at how effective or ineffective sanctions are. And by the time there are any serious moves on Taiwan, I think there will be such an effective counter-sanctions regime that might well prove to be the least even less effective than it's been in Russia. But I mean, there are differences between the Chinese record and the Russian record in terms of military interventions. Russia, as we heard in the previous section, has a long record of military intervention against its neighbors. China has expanded and consolidated territory that the Qing dynasty conquered, but its record of military engagement is relatively sparse. The last live war that China fought was against Vietnam in 1977, if my memory serves me correctly, and they lost. They were thoroughly thrashed by the Vietnamese. The Chinese call this the self-defensive counterattack, which also tells you that they don't like to be seen as an aggressor. So I think that, if there is, and they've spent a lot of effort in building up military capability since then, and in trying to ensure that, unlike the Russians, that corruption isn't so severe in the armed forces that if you try and drive a tank, you find that nobody's checked it for 10 years and it won't move. So there is a lot of effort on that. I still feel that there are better options for Xi Jinping than a military assault, which is extremely high risk in lots of ways. And it would give a better result. I mean, if you want to do two things, you want to, have your name in the history books as the person who finally reunited China, and to capture TSMC, to capture something the entire world needs, and you would then have a monopoly supply of, you have to be quite careful how you do it. It's not clear that TSMC would survive an assault like that, not least because it might choose not to. So, there are things to consider. One thing we don't know is how well informed Xi Jinping is about these options, and that's something which is fairly unknowable. As far as balancing the horrors, responding and appropriately to the horrors in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and dealing with China, it's a very tricky issue. I mean, we do remember that throughout the Cold War, there were arms agreements where in those areas in which the future of humanity is on the line, nuclear war, or I would argue climate change, then I think we just have to maintain the conversations, because in the end it doesn't help the people of Xinjiang, if humanity is overwhelmed by climate change either. I don't think that means that we forgive or forget Xinjiang. I just think we have to maintain multiple track conversations. And I do think that that's doable, because whatever you do about China, China doesn't go away. And a lot of what I hear about we must not deal with China, it reminds me of, when your children are very little and they put their hands in front of their eyes because it makes you disappear, and then they can do what they like. It's a bit like that. China doesn't disappear when we stop dealing with it. And there are areas in which it really is of mutual benefit to collaborate. There are people in China, and I've known many of them over the years, who have the same feelings and ambitions about climate change as we do. And surely we should be helping them. The problem, or collaborating with them. And the problem with making China into a complete overall enemy is that it also bleeds into domestic politics. So one of the things I've constantly heard over the years, and isn't true, is China doesn't care about climate change and it's not doing anything. as long as that's a trope in domestic politics, the next thing is, so why should we
It's
bother?
always, yes, why should we when China builds a new coal station
Exactly. And, you know, I set up an organization in 2006 to try and at least get better information into the world on that. And you know, we have to maintain the integrity, if you like, of the information and to seek collaboration where we can. Now, you don't have to trust an entire state in order to trust people within that state. You don't have to trust a government in order to find a university to partner with or a company to find a partner in China to manufacture and then distribute a new technology. You don't have to trust Xi Jinping to find ways of collaborating at different levels in China. And even again, you know, going back to the Cold War, when I don't think trust was a hugely rich supply between Washington and Moscow, we managed arms agreements of rather significant nature. So I don't think that our values will ever match up, but that's a fact. And the next thing is, so what do we do about it? How do we manage our differences? How do we contain the fallout from those differences so we don't destroy something that we just can't recover?
Just as a quick follow-up to the Ukraine issue, the impression I got was that Putin went to see Xi Jinping just before the invasion during the Olympics and apparently gave him the assurance of it'll be over in 4 days and we'll be in control. And then, of course, there's the quagmire. And one of the reasons for the quagmire is badly manufactured Chinese military goods, incidentally, which can't have pleased Xi Jinping too overly. So I got the impression in that first phase of the war that Xi Jinping was probably pissed off with Putin for having accelerated a confrontation with the West, and he's the senior partner. He chooses when and where the confrontation takes place, not somebody who can't deliver on his 4-day promises in Moscow. So that having happened, though, the sanctions having been imposed, North Korea suddenly playing a more significant role internationally because of the relationship with Russia. Does Xi Jinping now think he has to pretty much back Russia and take the hits from the West because he cannot afford for Putin to lose, be humiliated, the Russian Federation collapse, etc.?
I think he can't afford for Putin to fail, and that I don't think he's particularly happy about that. Because, you know, that meeting you refer to in the Winter Olympics, you know, it made Xi Jinping look either like a fool or a knave, and that's, you know, he doesn't like that. They have a kind of shared worldview in the sense that they both think that the West is in terminal decline and that therefore there is a massive opportunity for China and Russia. And if you think for most of the 20th century, Russia was the senior partner in this relationship, and that is now completely reversed. So there is a dependency, which is some kind of assurance for China on that very, very long border, which is extremely contentious has been extremely contentious since World War II. So, but on the downside, you know, given that what China was hoping to do was to divide the European Union from the United States politically
and economically,
that was very annoying. And it seems quite clear that Xi Jinping had no idea what would happen when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think that, you know, we think the Chinese are, you know, superhuman, but actually they can be quite badly informed about things. And one of the disadvantages of a highly authoritarian system such as the one that Xi Jinping has reconstructed is that messages take a very long time to reach the brain if they get there at all. And that's a problem.
And that's what a really interesting thing about that is his decision to decapitate some of the most important financial and technological companies in China.
Yeah.
So who's going to run them? Where is that dynamism that we saw
Well, that's, again, going back to your question about what went wrong with the economy. I mean, it is obvious that Xi Jinping is putting politics before economics. These companies became too powerful. Jack Ma had said something disobliging about the central bank, and off one of the most famous and successful entrepreneurs in China, gone.
Disappeared.
Yes. The private tutoring business, destroyed overnight. And then that was, again, worth millions. And now people are having to disguise, private tutors as nannies in order to get the tutoring. It hasn't done away with the business. It's just driven it underground. I mean, he has made some very, very odd calls. And you're right. And now, again, a whole raft of legislation and regulation which seems to be anti-foreign. So, a new security law, and some raids on Western companies that do due diligence for investors. Their offices get raided. The question, are they going to be charged with espionage under the new national security laws? Well, you can't do that and expect foreigners to rush in with new rounds of investment. And you can see from, we are not decoupling, but the new investment has really plunged. So we are kind of bumping along the bottom at the moment.
Have we got one more question there at the back with, I think, a turquoise dress?
Thank you very much for your insights. Very, very interesting. My name is Susan Perkins. I teach English at various Fachhochschulen, universities of applied sciences and different educational institutions. I have a fairly quick question. How important do you consider the Belt and Road project? How important, or what kind of impact does it have on what we've been discussing? Thank you.
Belt and Road. Launched in 2013 in Kazakhstan by Xi Jinping. In the first few months, it was a hasty relabeling of existing projects, as happens in China. So it's a big announcement with no content. There still is no ministry that is responsible for assessing Belt and Road success or failure. But what you see is, for the first 3 years, a huge amount of finance for largely energy projects, but also a lot of infrastructure. So heavy stuff, financed by Chinese banks. And these are conducted by state-owned enterprises which have a cozy relationship with banks. And they include things like railways, roads, bridges, and coal-fired power stations. So they're not, given the state of the world, they're not, certainly the latter, not helpful. Xi Jinping 3 years ago announced there would be no new coal-fired power stations. So fast forward, it's now 10 years since the launch of Belt and Road, and the arc of investment, which went way up, then declines very quickly after 2015. So that those high spirits, in which essentially China promised to a whole series of countries that they could emulate the Chinese development model, which was never true, but that infrastructure would kickstart a phase of development that would lead to prosperity. That very short-lived phase came to an end partly with the global financial crisis, then with COVID, but also with the discovery that these debts were unsustainable, that the rewards from those investments were not sufficient to meet what were often quite stiff terms in Chinese financing. So China didn't pay for these projects, they financed them, often at rates of 6% or so. And the returns just couldn't, the returns from the investment couldn't meet the interest payments. So China now is largely managing debt on the Belt and Road. I don't subscribe to the idea that this was a deliberate policy. I think it was a policy born of inexperience, because China hadn't done this before. A lack of due diligence, a confidence that the state would always back them, whatever happened. But now Chinese lending is amongst the most cautious in the world. So what does that mean for Belt and Road? There are a number of projects which are functioning. There are a number of projects which are unfinished. And there is a turn in emphasis now towards the idea that China is a development actor of a different sort, that there will be no more big projects, but small is beautiful. So it's all really kind of calmed down a bit. It has left permanent advantages in some ways. For example, in telecoms, China has installed most of the telecoms in Africa. But the disadvantages are that a lot of countries are now indebted to China and are not very happy with the results. So I think it's been a pretty mixed success. The Japanese version of this, which I referenced earlier, was a little more disciplined in that the Japanese didn't have that combination of state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks, which could just kind of carry on. So they were constrained by the need for serious returns, and so it was less extravagant. And now, you know, everyone is going to be paying for that first 5 years of Belt and Road for quite a long time, and there isn't going to be a lot of money for the other things that countries need. But going back to the collaboration point, if China were at this point to say, well, what we're going to do now is low carbon energy development in Africa, for example, which they could do, it would be transformative. And to do that, they need to start having faith in their private companies, which are what dominate the new energy, or the SOEs are going to have to adopt clean energy instead of coal-fired power stations. If China were to manage that transition, again, that would be really important and very, very helpful.
Isabel, thank you so much. China is obviously going to be at the center of the world economy and politics for the next 20, 30, God knows how many years. Thanks to Isabel, I hope that you'll be able to interpret and understand it better as it rolls out. So please join me in a big round of applause for Isabel Hilton.